for this day, we will be discussing lesson 3 of module 1, which is the last lesson for module 1. For this lesson, we will be still discussing those concepts that are more complex than the Mendelian inheritance, the Mendelian concept of inheritance. This is still outside Mendelian concept, but it doesn't mean also that it will not follow the law of segregation and law of independent assortment. Actually, even in linkage or sex linkage, if you have read our references, even in sex linkage, Mendel's laws were still applicable, particularly the law of segregation and law of independent assortment. And then for this lesson also, we will be discussing how to interpret pedigree. Let's start our discussion for lesson 3. If we recall yung previous lessons, di ba, Mendel was able to coin the term quote-unquote factors. And this is what we call now as genes, which are located on the chromosome. And then each gene, as based from our lesson, each gene has a specific location on a chromosome. We call this locus. Again, if you recall, each gene has a specific location on the chromosome, which we call locus. So how do biologists or how do scientists see, or how are they able to visualize the genes, or how are they able to sequence the genes of an individual? So using fluorescent dyes that will highlight the gene of interest, they will be able to see ano ba yung characteristic ng mga genes, ano ba yung characteristic na nandoon sa specific location na yon. So an example of a fluorescent dye applied to a specific gene of interest is this one. So from this image, ang gene of interest po dyan ay yung kulay violet. Pero bakit kaya dyan ay maraming kulay? May blue, may green. Actually, in biology or even in other fields like chemistry, once we use stains, hindi pwedeng isang factor lang or isang part lang yung stain. You should also stain the background, so you will be able to distinguish, or you will be able to correctly stain your gene of interest. And then this is just an example how the field of cell biology improved over time. Kasi itong unang image, ito na yung improvement. Kumbaga, ito na yung pinaka-detailed na staining. While if we compare it from the past, we have this image wherein that's only black and white. You really don't know kung yun ba ay sister chromatids, kung yun ba ay homologous chromosome or what. Okay, so these are one of the major developments in the field of science, particularly in the field of genetics and cell biology. And as you may all know, yung based from our past discussions, you will be observing that there are some concepts wherein cell biology and genetics meet. So, example, dun sa mga concepts ni Mendel na law of segregation, if you will look at meiotic cell division or meiosis, even mitosis, you will be able to see that the concepts of Mendel or the concepts of genetics also apply to cell biology or cytology. Okay? So in that case, during those times when the scientists were able to see the relationship between cytology and genetics, they formed the theory what we call the chromosome theory of inheritance. So what they did with this theory of inheritance, they were able to compare, or they were able to see the similarities between the concepts of cell biology and genetics, and that would be Sutton and Boveri. So they were able to propose the chromosome theory of inheritance. So one example of the similarity that they saw in cell biology and genetics is this one. So they are observing the similarities between cell division and the two main laws of inheritance, which is the law of segregation and law of independent assortment. So if you recall dun sa ating, di ba yung sa meiosis, pag ang parent cell po ay nag-undergo ng meiosis, it will produce haploid daughter cells. So in the case of Mendel's experiment, di ba, he experimented on garden peas. So let's say there are 4 chromosomes, tapos to form the gamete of the parents, kahit siya ay plant, meron pa ring male and female, kailangan yung gamete ay haploid. So from the parent generation, when they form gametes that undergoes meiosis. So yun yung isang relationship between cell biology and genetics. And then when these gametes join, they will fertilize each other, and then dun magkakaroon ng diploid. So when, di ba, yung claim ni Mendel, yung isang set ng ating alleles will be coming from one parent, and then the other cell will be coming from another parent. So when these gametes combine, so they will form a diploid organism, and then they will also undergo cell division. Pwedeng mitosis, pwedeng meiosis. Kung meiosis, gamete formation. Kung mitosis naman ay for growth and development. Okay? So, nag-apply sa F1 generation ang law of segregation. In the law of segregation, the 2 alleles for each gene separate. Di ba yun ang sabi sa law of segregation? And if you will also observe sa meiosis and even mitosis, when they separate, random lang din po ang separation nila. It doesn't mean na lahat ng kulay blue napupunta lang sa right, or lahat ng kulay red napupunta lang sa left. So random segregation, particularly of non-homologous chromosomes. And then the second law also applies, which is the law of independent assortment. So for the law of independent assortment, alleles of genes on non-homologous chromosome assort independently. So if you will also observe in the meiotic cell division, the segregation of one allele or one homolog will not affect the segregation of another non-homolog chromosome or non-homologous chromosome. And then after Mendel, so di ba sabi ko sa inyo last time, after Mendel, meron pang experiment for non-Mendelian genetics, and there is also a follow-up experiment conducted by Thomas Morgan. Okay, so kung si Mendel, he studied the garden peas, Thomas Morgan studied an animal or an insect, particularly the fruit fly. So the fruit fly is known as the Drosophila melanogaster. So sa Filipino, ang tawag dito ay langusuka. Ito yung mga lumilipad kapag let's say may naiwanan na fruits na walang cover or walang takip. Ito yung lumilipad, langusuka. Yun yung Drosophila melanogaster. So, parang, bakit kaya si Morgan, ang pinili niyang test organism is Drosophila melanogaster? Actually, medyo magkatulad sila ni Mendel. Yung reason kung bakit successful yung experiment ni Morgan. So, one reason is that these fruit flies, they produce many offspring. If you recall, kay Mendel, yung garden peas, marami ring offspring ang pinoproduce, and they both have short generation time. So take 2 weeks lang sila. Like Drosophila melanogaster, a generation can be bred every 2 weeks, and each generation time, each week, maraming fruit flies. It can go to hundreds or even thousands of fruit flies produced. And then kagaya rin ni Mendel, di ba, if you recall, Mendel chose to observe only 2 contrasting traits and then 7 characteristics. So for Morgan, the easier part of his study was because the Drosophila melanogaster has only 4 pairs of chromosomes. So for his study, madali lang din siya compare kapag sa animals. So ang isang difference ng experiment nila, si Mendel work on plants, and then si Morgan work on animals, particularly insects. During his experiment, he was able to distinguish a wild type phenotype and a mutant phenotype. So what do we mean by wild type phenotype or mutant phenotype? Baka kasi sa ibang reference, you will see na ito yung wild type, ito yung mutant. So when we say wild type phenotype, this is a phenotype common among the population. So in the case of Morgan's when we say phenotype, ito po yung physical appearance, if you recall. So if in the case of Morgan's experiment, the wild type phenotype in the Drosophila melanogaster is the red-colored eyes. Okay, so yun yung wild type. And then any alternative to the wild type is called the mutant phenotype. Okay, so dun sa experiment ni Morgan, ang mutant phenotype is a white-colored fruit fly. Again, pag wild type, it is a phenotype common among the population. And then, yung alternative to the wild type is called the phenotype. Ito yung less common among the population. In the human perspective, if we compare sa human perspective, sa mga Pinoy po, ang common na eye color is brown. So, yun yung wild type sa atin. And then, if there are cases na, let's say, even pure Filipino, tapos nagkaroon bigla ng blue-colored eyes, that would be the mutant phenotype. Okay, this is less common among the population. And then, ano ba yung naging result ng experiment ni Morgan? Ano yung difference ng experiment niya with Mendel? Kasi if we look at it, yung experiment nila, although different organisms, same lang naman kung bakit naging successful yung kanilang experiment. So what did Morgan do is he crossed a male fly with white eyes with the mutant allele with the female fly with red eyes or the wild type phenotype or the wild type allele. Okay, so saan nyo malalaman yung isang difference? Doon kay Mendel, hindi niya in-specify actually kung alin sa purple flower at saka sa white flower ang male at saka female. Kasi if in plants naman, it doesn't really matter kung saan magkakaroon ng fertilization. Okay, although mayroong male and female din talaga ang plants. But then, in Morgan's experiment, he specified the sex of the test organism. So, for example, in the fruit flies, male yung may white eye and then female yung may red eye. So, may similarity sila, may difference din. And then, after hybridization, where the F1 hybrids are formed, napansin niya na all ay red eyes, regardless of the sex of the test organism. So, if you will look at this, parang kay Mendel lang din. Kasi di ba kay Mendel purple color at saka white colored flower. So, when he combined them, lahat ay purple ang F1 generation. Anong pinagkaiba? Wala actually sa F1 generation. Kasi sa F1 generation, Morgan will also conclude that the red eyes will be dominant over the white eye. And then, he crossed the F1 generation with each other. So, F1 to F1, red eyes to red eyes. Tapos, during the F2 generation, 3:1 ratio pa rin naman yung nakuha niya, kagaya ng kay Mendel, sa purple at saka sa flower. So, sa Drosophila, he got a ratio of 3 red:1 white. So, ano pinagkaiba ng kanilang experiment? Dun sa F2 generation ni Morgan, he observed that only males had white eyes. Tapos yung female, lahat sila red eyes. Okay, so dito parang nag-wonder si Morgan, bakit kaya males lang ang nagkaroon ng white eyes? Bakit yung females, kahit isa, walang red eyes? So, our discussion today will be explaining that, na parang bakit nakadepende sa sex ng isang fruit fly yung kanyang eye color. Okay, so we will be discussing those later. And then, based from his observations, Morgan reasoned that the white-eyed mutant allele must be located on the X chromosome. And then Morgan's finding further supported the chromosome theory of inheritance. So just a closer look of Morgan's experiment. So you have the P generation, yung red-eyed female at saka white-eyed male. Tapos sa F1, nagkaroon lahat ng red eyes. But in the F2 generation, only males had white eyes. So the next concept that we will be discussing will be the sex-linked genes. Since, as I have said earlier, based dun sa experiment ni Morgan, he was able to distinguish ano ba yung, even though ang ratio ay kagaya ng kay Mendel, gaya ng experiment ni Mendel, ang pinagkaiba nila specific yung sex ng test organisms ni Morgan. Okay? So in the sex-linked genes, because of Morgan's discovery of a trait that is related with the sex of that lice, this is the key to the development of the chromosome theory of inheritance, particularly relating the concepts of meiosis at saka yung sa loss of inheritance. Kasi di ba sa meiosis ito po ay para sa formation ng gamete. Okay, and then ano ba yung chromosomal basis of sex? So for humans and other mammals, we have two types of sex chromosomes, a larger X chromosome and a smaller Y chromosome. For those individuals who have two X chromosomes, we are considered as females, biologically females, and then while a male develops from a zygote, one X and one Y. This is just to show you that different organisms, we have different types of sex chromosomes. So merong XX, may XY, may X0, may ZW, may ZZ, or may diploid or haploid. So for humans, we have 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs. If you recall from bio, dun sa 23 pairs ng chromosome, 22 pairs of those would be for autosomes, or what we call the body cells. And then the last pair of chromosomes for humans would be the sex cells or the gametes. And then for the grasshoppers or other insects, meron kang tinatawag na X0 system. So for females, XX din yung kanila, pero pag males, isa lang po ang kanilang isa lang yung kanilang sex chromosome, X lang. Okay, hindi kagaya ng humans na XY. And then for chickens, they have the CW system. So ang kanilang chromosome ay 78 lahat. 76 of those chromosomes would be siguro autosomes then or body cells, and then 2 of their chromosomes will be the gametes or the sex cells. And then for the haplodiploid system, particularly for bees, ito yung mga hymenopterans. So for the bees, ang kanilang determination ng sex, kapag diploid po ang organism, siya ay female. And then kapag naman haploid, ito po ay male. Kaya if you will observe sa bees, ang queen bee yung pinakamalaki. Kasi siya yung diploid organism. And it doesn't really mean din naman na kapag diploid, mas malaki ka. Yun nga lang, so kapag yung chromosome po ay may dalawang set, possible na nag-code siya for larger size or an increase in size. So if we compare yung queen bee sa worker bee, mas maliit po yung worker bees or yung males dun sa yung mga bees na male compared sa female bees. Okay, so yun yung haplodiploid system sa mga hymenopterans or sa bees. A gene on the Y chromosome called SRY, or the sex determining region of the Y, is responsible for the development of the testes in an embryo. Okay, so yung Y lang na yun ang magpe-predict kung alin ba talaga ang biological sex ng isang individual. Okay, kasi yung XX, pareho lang silang X na chromosome. So they code for the same genes. Okay, they contain the same genes. However, kapag XY siya, yung Y will dictate how the testes will be formed in an embryo. Okay? And then, for those genes that are located, like what Morgan concluded from his experiment, those genes that are located on either of the sex chromosome is what we call as the sex-linked genes. And then, from the name itself, Y-linked genes, these are the genes located on the Y chromosome. And then, for the genes located on the X chromosome, these are called the X-linked genes. So as you can see, in comparison of the number of genes associated with the chromosome, with the sex chromosome, mas kokonti yung associated with Y, and mas marami yung associated with the X chromosome. And if you have already read also our book, sinasabi doon na mostly yung mga genes or yung mga Y-linked genes are concerned more of determining the sex of an individual, the biological sex of an individual. While the X chromosome, some of them might code for some diseases, yung mga X-linked genes, they might code for some diseases or even some physical features of both males and females. Kasi di ba even males naman, meron pa rin kayong X chromosome, XY, yun nga lang, isa lang. Unlike kapag females, dalawa yung X chromosome. So X-linked genes follow a specific pattern of inheritance. Kagaya last week, meron tayong recessively inherited disorders at saka dominantly inherited disorders. So in X-linked inheritance, there are also X-linked recessive inheritance and X-linked dominant inheritance. So for a recessive X-linked trait to be expressed, kailangan a female needs 2 copies of the allele. So if you will recall the last week's discussion, you will still be using genotypes na exponential form. So bakit exponential form? For you to know kung saan ba nakalink yung gene of interest or yung gene na So sa X, automatic X-linked siya. Kapag naka-exponent siya sa Y, edi Y-linked. Okay? So for example, ang genotype ng for X-linked recessive inheritance, for it to be expressed, for the trait to be expressed, kailangan ang female ay 2 copies of the allele or quote-unquote homozygous recessive. So if we will write the genotype, let's use the letter A for the allele. So kung siya ay affected or the individual or the female contains the trait or exhibits the trait, the phenotype, so the genotype would be like this. Kasi recessive inheritance. X small a, X small a. Okay? And then, for males, a male needs only 1 copy of the allele. As you can see, since if we will be talking about X-linked inheritance, isa lang naman kasi yung X ng lalaki, X chromosome ng lalaki. So, they are called hemizygous. Okay? So, for those males that are hemizygous, this is their genotype. X small a, Y. Okay, affected sila kasi recessive inheritance. And then, X-linked recessive disorders are much more common in males than in females. So, you will see later bakit kaya mas common sa males ang X-linked recessive inheritance. Ang isang example dyan is baldness, tapos color blindness. Some disorders caused by recessive alleles on the X chromosome. So, as I have said earlier, color blindness. And then for the Duchenne muscular dystrophy, this refers to a muscular disorder wherein hindi okay yung limbs na individual. And then for hemophilia, this has something to do with your platelets or your your blood clotting mechanism. Kasi di ba kalimitan, pag yung mga tao na wala namang hemophilia, pag nagkasugat tayo tapos nagdugo, eventually it will stop. Once you apply pressure or parang mga iba't ibang ointment, titigil yung pagdudugo. Pero for those individuals who have hemophilia, pagka-severe na yung hemophilia, there are cases that they need blood transfusion for them to recover even in a small wound, from a small wound. Pedigree analysis. So sa pedigree analysis, this is a family tree that describes the interrelationship of parents and children across generations. So inheritance patterns of particular traits can be traced and described during using pedigrees. Ito yung ginagamit kalimitan ng mga genetic counselors for them to map out yung inheritance sa inyong family. Okay? So sa pedigree, you will be able to see some symbols in pedigree. Kapag square, male po, unshaded, circle, pang female. And then, as I have said earlier, pedigrees can be used to trace a specific trait. So if you will see that a male is shaded, so ibig sabihin, meron siyang trait na ating hinahanap. He expresses the trait that we are focusing on. And then likewise, kapag ang circle ay shaded, ibig sabihin yung female ay meron din yung trait. Ina-exhibit din niya yung trait, phenotypically. And then if you see a line between yung square at saka yung circle, So it denotes mating among the individuals. And then yung mga parang sanga-sanga nila, those are the offspring of the cross. So from left to right, birth order, firstborn hanggang bunso. Okay po. So, pedigrees can also be used to make predictions about future offspring. Ito nga yung ating sinasabi sa genetic counseling. So, going back sa X-linked recessive inheritance, females who are homozygous and males who are hemizygous express the phenotype, as I have said earlier. An affected mother passes the trait to all the offspring, but only the son exhibit the phenotype. Why? If you recall, di ba, ang genotype ng female ay XX, ang sex chromosome. Okay? And then, ang sex chromosome naman ng males would be XY. So, if you cross yung XX at saka XY, ano ba yung chances muna na magkakaroon ng lalaki or babaeng anak yung isang couple? As you can see sa pedigree, 50% chance na magkakaroon ng babae or lalaki. Kasi di ba may common superstition yung mga thunders, mga titas of the Philippines, na kapag, let's say, nagkaroon ng anak, kapag yung lalaki ay pasaway, kalimitan yung panganay ay babae. Yun ang sabi nila. Tapos kapag daw, hindi naman daw, lalaki yung magiging panganay. Actually, wala naman kasi talagang scientific basis. Kasi nga, as you can see dun sa Punnett square, a cross between XX at saka XY, merong 50% chance of having a boy and 50% chance of having a girl. Okay? So, hindi siya sa lakas ng dugo, hindi siya sa pagkasaway ng kung sino man. And then, going back to X-linked recessive inheritance, bakit kaya pinapasa ng mother ang traits to all the offspring but only the son exhibit the phenotype? If you will observe this Punnett square, yung kasing yung X chromosome ng lalaki, nangagaling siya sa nanay. Okay? Ito siya. Yung X chromosome na yun, nangagaling lang yan sa nanay. And then, bakit yung mga babae hindi ma-exhibit yung phenotype? Kasi yung dalawang X chromosome ng girls, one will be coming from the mother, let's say kung affected man siya, recessive, if the father is dominant. So, pwedeng mamask ng dominant allele yung recessive allele ng mother. Okay? Kasi dalawa yung X chromosome ng babae. Kaya, di ba kanina, parang sabi dun sa claiming organ, mas common yung X-linked recessive disorders dun sa males. Kasi yung X chromosome ng lalaki will be coming from the mother. So, if the mother is affected, automatic po, kapag X-linked recessive inheritance, affected din yung son. Kasi isa lang yung kanilang X chromosome. Okay? And then, an affected father passes the traits to all of his daughters but to none of his sons. Bakit wala sa sons? Kasi ang binibigay po ng father sa kanilang son ay Y chromosome. Okay? Yung X chromosome, ibibigay lang niya sa daughters niya. That's why, if the father is affected, he will pass the traits dun sa daughters, but keep in mind that these daughters can only be carriers. Why? Because the mother can have the dominant allele. So for the pedigree ng X-linked inheritance, so here's an example of a pedigree of X-linked inheritance. So maglagay lang kayo ng legend. Kung X-linked recessive inheritance siya, ano ba yung affected or yung nagmamanifest ng phenotype? So based on our previous discussion, the genotype of affected individuals, let's use A lang muna. Okay? So for females, you have homozygous recessive for the gene. And then for males naman, X, small a, Y, or hemizygous. So these are the affected individuals. You will just include or you will just identify the genotypes of the offspring or the individuals naman sa diagram. So in that case, if this circle is shaded, automatic, isa lang ang kanyang possible na genotype. That's why this would be X small a, X small a. Okay? And then, dun sa kanyang partner, which is unaffected male, so kapag unaffected, automatic, dominant dapat yung allele kasi unaffected siya. Okay? So in that case, that would be X, capital A, and then Y. Okay. And then, for the offspring naman, by the way, let me just correct this diagram. Ayan. Nakaganyan. So for the first offspring, which is unaffected male, yung naka-shade. So isa lang naman yung possible niyang genotype. So this is X small a Y. And then for the second offspring, unaffected female. So it's either homozygous or heterozygous. So ito kasi trial and error lang din. Basta you will satisfy yung describe ng pedigree. Okay, so in that case, this second offspring can be heterozygous or homozygous dominant. So you can try it na homozygous dominant. Okay, later nalaman niyo kung bakit trial and error siya. And then for the next offspring, which is an affected male, so this one is X small a Y. Okay? Tapos, yung last offspring, affected male uli, so X small a Y. And then, for the next one, yung partner ng second offspring, so unaffected male, so this would be X capital A Y. So, ganyan. And then, i-map out nyo rin yung sa offspring lang dalawa. So, as you can see, walang affected na individual. Kasi pag ito, ginawa nyo siyang heterozygous for the gene, possible na rin maging affected na anak. So as much as possible, you try to satisfy what the pedigree is describing. Hindi pala possible na homozygous dominant itong female na anak, since if you cross these two parents, ito yung first generation, if you cross the two parents, hindi possible yung dominant allele, homozygous dominant. Kasi if you will observe, ito yung Punnett square, XAY, and then X small a, X small a. So if you cross this one, walang magkakaroon ng genotype na homozygous dominant na babae. Okay? So I suggest that you have a Punnett square just to check if what you are writing is really possible. This one is heterozygous for the allele. So for the first child, since if you perform the cross of these two, so possible na dalawa yung kanilang genotypes. It's either yung girl can be homozygous dominant or heterozygous. So in that case, it's either you specify the possible genotype or you can make it this way, X capital A, X blank. Bakit may X blank? Kasi, again, it's your choice if you want to include a blank or you specify the possible gene. But you will only be allowed to include a blank kapag wala na siyang succeeding generation. Pag wala ng offspring, yung individual na nilalagay ng genotype. But again, you can specify. Pareho namang tama. Kung siya homozygous or heterozygous, pareho pa rin tama. You might just see some reference na XA tapos X blank. So yun yung ibig sabihin nun. There are two possible genotypes. But you can clearly specify it since there is no next generation. And then next one, itong male na to, this one is X capital A, Y. And then for the circle, yung last offspring, this one would be X capital A, tapos X blank. Again, you can specify kung ano ba yung genotype or you can just use blank. Tapos sa last offspring, ang partner niya ay unaffected. So it's either homozygous or heterozygous yung partner. So trial and error, kung alin na yung magsasatisfy dun sa pedigree na i-describe ng pedigree. If you choose to have a homozygous dominant individual which is unaffected. So if you will look at the Punnett square, if you construct a Punnett square here, so X small a Y and then X capital A, X capital A, if you will observe, walang offspring, particularly walang female offspring na affected. So therefore, hindi siya possible kasi hindi niya kayang isatisfy yung description ng pedigree. And then, in that case, you change the genotype. So we can change it to a heterozygous individual or a heterozygous female. Tapos sa pedigree, what you will be doing is you change the genotype also. Okay po. And then, as you can see, possible na merong female na affected. So you can determine na yung genotypes ng offspring. This one would be X, capital A, X.
Bakit in-specify ko na yung genotype? Kasi isa lang naman yung possible na genotype. Saka lang kayo gagamit ng blank kapag merong two possible answers. Okay? And then this one would be X, capital A, Y. And then this is unaffected female. So X, small a, X, small a. Okay? So may question ba so far? Please answer this example. Determine the genotypes of the individuals present in the pedigree. In the Punnett square, so hindi kasi possible yung homozygous dominant if you will perform the Punnett square ng cross na ito. So walang individual that will have a homozygous dominant, walang female, since both of them ay heterozygous. Okay, so yan yung example ng Punnett square. Okay, so this should be small a. Okay po. So linawan ko lang. X capital A, X small a. For number 10, since there will be two possible genotypes. So it's either you specify kung siya by homozygous dominant or heterozygous, or you can just write XA, X blank. Same as true with number 12. For the next one is what we call the X-linked dominant inheritance. So for X-linked dominant inheritance, individuals who have the dominant allele on the X chromosome will exhibit the phenotype. Therefore, for those individuals who are homozygous dominant and heterozygous, they will exhibit the phenotype. So ang hindi lang mag-exhibit ng phenotype would be those individuals who are recessive for the gene, or they contain both of the recessive alleles. And then, an affected male passes the alleles to all the daughters but to none of his sons. It was explained earlier. And then, an affected female passes the alleles to all the offspring unless she is a heterozygote. Since kapag heterozygote, one is dominant and the other one is recessive, possible na yung ibang offspring will be unaffected. Okay? So in that case, pag X-linked dominant inheritance, ang affected phenotype would be homozygous females and heterozygous as well. Tapos yung males na may dominant allele. Okay, so these are the affected individuals. Okay, so based on the legend, yung mga affected, kindly answer the example. So dito, sa example na to, I think wala naman tayong na-overlook na answer. Pero you can also, if the genotypes of the parents would be this one, pwede rin siyang mag-XA tapos X blank. Okay, kasi dalawa yung possible, if I'm not mistaken, dalawa yung possible genotypes for affected individuals. So they can either be homozygous or heterozygous. So you can use yung blank, XA, X blank. Let's move to the example wherein you will determine the type of inheritance and then also include the genotypes. So para hindi masyado matrabaho, you identify number 2 and then number 3, number 5, number... Ayun po. So for this pedigree, this would be an X-linked recessive inheritance. So later, you will see bakit siya X-linked recessive inheritance. Okay, pero X-linked recessive siya. Therefore, ang legend ninyo should be yung individuals who are females who are homozygous for the recessive alleles would be affected, and also hemizygous males. So these are the genotypes. Meron ba tayong na-over? By the way, some of you might be wondering bakit merong Roman numerals. So these Roman numerals indicate the generation. So based on this pedigree, first generation yung Roman numeral number 1, yun yung doon nagsimula yung pagtitrace nila ng inheritance. Okay? So, pag Roman numeral, yun yung first generation, Roman numeral number 2, second generation, and so on. Paano ko malalaman if X-linked, recessive, or dominant siya? It's a trial and error process. So, paano siya maging trial and error? Kasi let's say you chose X-linked dominant. So, see if your test cross will satisfy all the given conditions of the pedigree. Pero ang alam ko kasi, kapag ito, trinay mong X-linked dominant, hindi magmamatch. May magmamatch na, let's say, ilang shapes or ilang individuals, pero not all of the individuals will match X-linked dominant. So, kailangan, trial and error talaga siya. So, itatry po namin both, tapos kung alin po yung magmamatch, yun po. Ganun siya. You can try them both and then see if which type of inheritance will match the given condition ng panlista ng pedigree. So for the link, there are some genes, as I have said earlier, there are genes that are located on the same chromosome. And these genes, some of them tend to be inherited together, and we call them as linked genes. Okay, but again, independent assortment, hindi naman nakaka-apekto yung lalo na kapag non-homologous chromosome, they will not affect the assortment of other genes. But again, these genes that are located on the same chromosome, some of them tend to be inherited together, and we call them as linked genes. And then there are also cases when non-parental phenotypes were also produced in the test cross. So halimbawa, in the human perspective, there are cases wherein meron kayong characteristic na hindi characteristic ng inyong magulang. Kasi di ba parang kung isipin mo, kung sa magulang ako nagmana ng alleles at saka ng genes, bakit meron akong non-parental phenotype? Hindi ibig sabihin na ampun ka, pero ibig sabihin lang po, yung possible na, di ba remember the concepts of polygenic inheritance and multiple alleles. There are some genes controlled by multiple alleles, and then there are some phenotypes controlled by multiple genes. So in that case, if one set of your chromosomes will be coming from your father and one set will be coming from your mother, when they combine, possible na yung sa polygenic traits or yung sa multiple alleles, magpo-produce sila ng bagong phenotype, which is not resemblance of your parents. And we call that process as genetic recombination. Okay, when we say genetic recombination, this is the production of offspring with combinations of traits differing from either parent. Actually, genetic recombination is not bad. It is a sign of evolution. Hindi kasi, when we talk about evolution, hindi ibig sabihin na nag-evolve ka, parang Pokemon lang na from Pikachu maging Raichu. Hindi siya ganun. There are, particularly in humans and yung more complex animals and organisms, they evolve in a way na hindi minsan kita ng naked eye or hindi siya nakikita ng yung simple testing lang or biochemical tests. Makikita siya pag na-sequence na yung genes. Okay, so yung genetic recombination is a form of evolution so that we can adapt to our changing environment. If you are familiar with Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, yung natural selection, yung survival of the fittest, for us to survive our changing environment, kailangan maging fit tayo for that. And that is one of the advantages of having genetic recombination. And if you remember from last week's discussion, yung consanguineous mating or yung incest among the family members, isang reason din kung bakit hindi siya advisable ay dahil walang genetic recombination, because you belong to the same gene pool. Kasi kumbaga, you belong to the same family. That's why genetic recombination is, kumbaga, merong parang lower probability of having genetic recombination. Okay? And then, there are also some cases wherein the chromosome numbers are altered and it causes genetic disorders. Some of them, they might be detrimental or they can cause miscarriage, or if magsusurvive naman yung individual, there will be developmental disorders. So sometimes, there will be mental disorders, pwedeng physical, pwedeng nasa emotional or other aspects of human life. And then, yung mga aberrations or yung mga alterations sa chromosome numbers, when it comes to plants, they handle these genetic changes better than animals do. Kasi pag animals, kalimitan, particularly humans, pag nagkaroon ng genetic disorders, talagang irreversible na. Unlike plants, they handle stress, or meron kasi pati kasi mga plants na stress. Pero there is a branch in botany, the study of plants, that is called stress physiology. So yung stress physiology ng plants, this is how plants handle stress. Okay, kaya yung genetic changes are also stress to the plants, but when it comes to the stress management of plants, hindi siya kagaya ng mga animals na talagang kung mga tao talagang nai-stress siya. Kapag ang plants po ay nai-stress, they turn the stress into something useful for them. And then, for abnormal chromosome number, di ba kanina sinabi ko sa inyo na yung different organisms, you have different chromosome numbers. So for example, for chickens, they have 78. Ang humans naman merong 46. There is the abnormal chromosome number, which is caused by non-disjunction. When we say non-disjunction, if you recall yung concept ng meiosis, wherein during anaphase 1 and anaphase 2, nagseseparate yung homologous chromosome pag anaphase 1, pag naman anaphase 2, nagseseparate yung sister chromatids. So in non-disjunction, these pairs of homologous chromosome fail to separate normally during meiosis. So as a result, if they fail to separate during meiosis, therefore one gamete will receive an excess copy of the chromosome, and then the other gamete will receive no copy at all. So for you to visualize this non-disjunction, look at this diagram wherein one cell is experiencing non-disjunction during meiosis 1. So yung resulting cell will have an excess number of chromosomes, while the other cell naman, dun siya sa meiosis 2, nagkaroon ng non-disjunction. So either of the two cases, they will produce abnormal chromosome number for the daughter cells. Okay? And then, due to non-disjunction, aneuploidy will be a result of non-disjunction, which results from the fertilization of gametes in which non-disjunction occurred, and offspring with this condition have an abnormal number of a particular chromosome. So, if we will be talking about in the human perspective, ang aneuploidy po, we will be talking about specific chromosome numbers. So, di ba, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and then there are two types of aneuploidy, yung monosomic and trisomic. So, pag monosomic, the chromosome that we are focusing on has only one copy. Remember, for each organism, we have two copies of each chromosome. So, kapag monosomic, isa lang yung copy na meron ka. Ang fun fact lang doon, para malaman nyo kung siya ay monosomy or trisomy, when we say monosomy 18, ibig sabihin, monosomy, one copy of, ano ba yung monosomy 18? One copy of the 18th chromosome. Okay, yun yung genetic term for monosomy 18. And then, there is also a condition wherein we have a trisomic zygote. When we say trisomic, from the name itself, trisomic, so there are three copies of a particular chromosome. So, ang example, kapag trisomy 21, ibig sabihin, there are three copies of the 21st chromosome. Yun yung aneuploidy. We are talking about a specific chromosome. And then, there is also what we call the polyploidy. So, the difference between aneuploidy and polyploidy, kapag polyploidy, we are talking about how many sets of chromosomes for the individual. So in the case of humans or in other animals, we have 2 sets of chromosomes. Kaya siya naging 46 kasi 2 sets ng 23 chromosomes. Pag polyploidy naman, this refers to the organism who has more than 2 complete sets of chromosomes. So we call it triploidy if the organism have 3 sets of chromosomes, tetraploidy if they have 4 sets of chromosomes. And this condition is more common in plants, but parang wala pang nababalita sa animals. And in case, sabi nga natin kanina, ang plants, they handle genetic changes better than animals do. So it's either mas malaki lang yung bunga niya or possible na mas marami lang siyang flowers, mas marami siyang leaves or something. Ganun yung polyploidy sa plants. Hindi siya yung parang kagaya ng animals na parang merong abnormality na makaka-apekto dun sa function niya. Okay? And then, for the chromosome structure, there are also alterations. Hindi lang siya sa chromosome number. So instead of discussing the definition, I will just show you an illustration. So pag deletion, if we talk about the segments of the chromosomes, kapag deletion, from the name itself, a segment is removed from the chromosome. So madedelete yung isang segment ng chromosome. And always keep in mind that even a simple deletion might greatly affect the appearance of an organism or the phenotypes of an organism. And then there is what we call duplication, wherein a segment is repeated dun sa chromosome structure. And then inversion, if there is a change or reverse in order of the segment. And then for translocation, yung one segment of one chromosome moves to as another segment of a non-homologous chromosome, which might be detrimental kasi magkakaiba na yung sequence nila. And then for human disorders due to chromosomal alterations, there are some disorders na mild. There are also some serious disorders. Some of these disorders, they might be allowing the individual to have a longer lifespan, and there are also some genetic disorders na namamatay na dun sa birth pa lang. So yung surviving individuals, grabe active yung mga manok, di ba? So yung surviving individuals have a set of symptoms or a syndrome characteristics of the type of aneuploidy. Kasi nga kanina sabi dun sa polyploidy, hindi siya nag-exist sa animals, most likely sa plants. So in humans, most of the time, ang cases ng humans would be aneuploidy. It's either monosomy or trisomy. So one example is the Down syndrome or trisomy 21. So discuss ko lang kanina, pag trisomy 21, there are 3 copies of the 21st chromosome. And then, for trisomy 21, yung Down syndrome, if you will observe, bakit magkakamukha yung may mga Down syndrome na individuals? Kasi yung 21st chromosome has something to do with the facial features of humans. So, dahil sila may tagdatatlong copies ng 21st chromosome, possible na talagang magkakamukha sila because they are encoding the same gene, yung excess copy. Okay? And hindi pa, sabi ko nga, ang pagkakaroon ng child na may Down syndrome is just a chance. Hindi siya namamana. In the first place, ang individuals na may trisomy 21 ay sterile or they are unable to reproduce. So isang nakikita na lang factor ng mga geneticists, although this is still under being studied, one reason for having a child with Down syndrome is the maternal age or yung age ng mother during the conception or during pregnancy. Kasi di ba yung mga lalaki kapag sila ay even 70 or 80 years old, they can still get a girl pregnant. Okay? But yung girls, once we are born, automatic, nung tayo, let's say, nung pinanganak tayo, ito na yung number of egg cells, hanggang yun na yun talaga. Hindi siya madagdagan, hindi siya mabawasan unless magpa-remove ka ng ovaries. And then also, yung age ng girls will also equate to the age of your egg cell. So kung ikaw ay nasa 32 years old, edi 32 na din. Ang 32 years old na rin yung inyong egg cell. So that's what happens. And dati, 38 years old yung risky or yung parang high risk of having children na may Down syndrome. Tapos, well, due to lifestyle changes din ng people over time, bumaba siya ng 35, naging 32. So, hindi rin naman ibig sabihin na merong maternal factor. Again, chances lang din naman ito. And siguro napapataas lang ng chances yung maternal age. Okay? So, hindi rin ibig sabihin na merong risky age for pregnancy. Time na sa inyo para magbuntis. Hindi po. Kasi yung age ninyo ngayon ay hindi pa rin well-developed ang inyong reproductive system to bear a child. Okay? Although nag-develop na siya, pwede na there are cases of teenage pregnancy, pero hindi pa talaga siya well-developed. Unless nasa 24, 23, or 20, hanggang 28 years old. Yun, parang yun yung peak ng pagkakaroon ng anak. Okay? So, hindi siya indication na dahil merong risky na 32 or 35, kailangan nyo nang mag-anak ngayon. Okay? And by the way, ito, as you can see sa karyotype ng individual, 3 yung copies ng 21st chromosome niya. Ito siya. And then, di ba, common yung facial features na may mga Down syndrome. So, dito ko rin sinasabi sa mga estudyante ko na hindi kailangan tawagin na may mga Down syndrome na mongoloid or retarded. Although given na sila ay retarded, you don't have to slap them in the face and tell them that you are retarded. Commonly, yung mga educated people, we including you, we call them special children. Okay? So, kasi yung mongoloid, it's parang racist. Kasi bakit, saan man nanggaling yung mongoloid na term for Down syndrome? Yung kasing si John Langdon Down, siya yung nakadiscover ng, siya yung nakadiscover ng Down syndrome. And then, si John Langdon Down is parang, if I'm not mistaken, he is of Mongolian descent. That's why people call the individuals who have Down syndrome as mongoloids. So, hindi rin siya pwede. Lahat ng lalo na yung mga learning disabilities, we call them as special children. Okay? So, kayo po ay isang healthcare professional in the future. Ayoko marinig na natatawagin nyo yung mga tao na retarded or mongoloid. Okay? And then, for aneuploidy of sex chromosomes, hindi lang yung autosomes ang merong aneuploidy, pati po yung sex chromosomes. So, in the aneuploidy of sex chromosomes, there is what we call the Klinefelter syndrome, wherein males have an extra X chromosome. So, ang kanilang sex chromosome ay 3, XXY. So, ano ba yung manifestation ng may Klinefelter syndrome? Ito yung males na pag nag-undergo ng puberty, instead of experiencing the characteristics of a male undergoing puberty, dahil sa meron silang extra X chromosome, ang na-experience ng changes ay pang babae. So, di ba yung mga males, when they undergo puberty, nagbabroaden yung shoulders, lumalalim yung voice, tapos yung may mga chest hair, ganyan, or other indications na male yung kanyang development. Pero with individuals having Klinefelter syndrome, instead of broadening yung shoulders, widening ng hips, enlargening ng breast, mga ganun po, yung mga pangbabae na features during puberty. And then, there is also what we call the XYY syndrome. So, lalaki pa rin siya kasi may Y chromosome. So, XYY naman, wala pa siyang manifestation na talagang established. Pero some of the studies claim that individuals who have XYY syndrome tend to exhibit criminal behavior. But again, this is still under study. So, hindi naman tayo pwedeng maging judgmental na, oh my gosh, criminal siya. So, XYY syndrome yun. Hindi naman ganun. Okay? And then, there is also females na may XXX, 3 X na, ang dami naman yung X, grabe naman. Okay, so X chromosome, 3 X chromosomes, they have no unusual physical features, but most likely it has something to do with their learning disabilities. And then there is also a case sa females na monosomy X or monosomy X, so meaning monosomy 1 copy of the X chromosome. So ito ay termed as Turner syndrome, wherein females are sterile. And ito lang naman yung alam na monosomy monosomy disease or disorder sa humans. And then lastly, okay. So lastly, we have the syndrome cry of the cat. So results of from a specific deletion in chromosome number 5. So ano yung manifestation ng yung deletion sa chromosome number 5? A child born with this syndrome is intellectually disabled and they have a cat-like cry. Commonly, namamatay na siya before during infancy or early childhood. Okay, another cause ng altered chromosome or another disorder caused by structurally altered chromosome is yung chronic myelogenous leukemia or yung cancer. Ito ay isang certain type ng leukemia na inherited. Okay, so caused by translocation of chromosomes. This is an example. From chromosome number 9, meron siyang segment na lipat sa chromosome number 22. So always remember, even a small deletion, a small translocation will really affect the phenotype of the individual, particularly yung humans. Kasi sobrang complex ng human genome. When you say genome, ito yung totality ng genes ng humans. So yung human genome, sobrang complex niya na hanggang ngayon hindi pa rin tapos na yung Human Genome Project. Na-identify yan ng mga scientists yung mga genes ng mga tao. Pero they are still not able to explain ano ba yung mga polygenic traits. Kasi sobrang dami ng genes, parang hindi mo rin alam kung pag nag-select ka ba, lahat yung mag-work to give you a specific gene. Pero let's see, since ang dami namang improvement sa field ng science,